Thank you. And thanks to AB InBev and the 100 Plus Accelerator for hosting this event. It's always a pleasure partnering with IIT and Joe and his team. And it's great that you're all taking time out of your day to be here today for this conversation, a topic I'm passionate about. I've been working on water issues for most of my career, 30 years. And we have talked about collective action for a long time within the CO Water Mandate. For those not familiar with the CO Water Mandate, we launched in 2007. And there are 6 commitment areas that companies take when they join the CO Water Mandate, almost 500 companies that are now members. One of them is collective action, actually. But I would be honest with you in saying that in 2007, there was a lot of ambition around collective action, but not a lot of practice in doing it, and really doing it in a meaningful way that is leading to outcomes at a scale that's right-sized for the scale of the challenge. And water is one of those issues that we all know is not heading in the right direction when you look at freshwater resources and some of the indicators used that globally on how we track it. And there's a realization that we need to start working together more meaningfully if we're going to actually turn the needle in any given basin around the world. So I've jumped ahead a little bit, but I do want to call out that collective action is really hard to do in practice. It's a great theory, but it's something that really takes an intention. The analogy I used, I'm not a physicist, but there is a physics analogy here where the natural order is toward entropy. And anytime that you're trying to do any sort of coordination or organization, you have to put energy into organizing because that's not, the natural tendency is to dissipate, right? So there's a corollary there for the way we need to think about water and coordinated action on water and how that's actually going against the natural interest of individual organizations that'll always potentially want to pursue what's in their interest around water. Ooh, small font. So the point I want to make here is that already water impacts and the risks associated of those impacts for businesses is material, and it's today. It's happening today. And you could try to add up this impact in the way that the various organizations here have tried to look at different dimensions of water and how much that impact is causing economic harm. But it is somewhere annually in the $400 to $600 billion in impact around water. And that's not a future projection, although the last one is at the bottom here under the international climate change scenarios. But what we can also say is that due to climate change and the way that climate is going to impact water systems, both in terms of too much water and the floods that are more frequent and also more pronounced, but also on the other side of the equation where we're getting longer dry periods, drier, hotter hots, drier dries. And that is not going to change. That's already happening, but it is not going to change. And as we go forward, we need to therefore start thinking about how we're going to tackle water in a way that recognizes that it is fundamentally a systems issue. You can't deal with water risk without understanding the way that water connects to virtually all aspects of our society and our economy, right? And so we have to understand that if you look at where the global water demand is as a whole, it's agriculture. And therefore, if you don't figure out how you can solve for agriculture in most of these regions, you're likely not going to be able to have the impact at the scale that's necessary. On the other hand, we have industry and manufacturing, we have communities and the distribution of water. But increase in population, the economy that goes with that means that there's going to be more pressure on these systems, and we are already in water-stressed areas around the world, more than 3 billion people living in these areas. So the CO Water Mandate 5 years ago launched an initiative called the Water Resilience Coalition. And in the DNA of this initiative was the recognition that companies have had at the global level, the leading companies, that we need a architecture for collaborating that will allow us to have impact on water and address this stress that's faced everyone. And a little bit of an aside, many of these companies have had very good bilateral partnerships with an NGO partner, whether it's a conservation organization or a organization focusing on water access for the poor. But when they did that inward deep reflection, they realized that those partnerships, as impactful as they were not actually de-risking any of these basins. It wasn't like all of a sudden water security was improving in the area. And that's because these bilateral partnerships are not scoped in a way that will allow us to actually change conditions in a basin. So the idea was, and this was also innovative around the WRC, the Water Resilience Coalition, is that we can set a global goal to try to work together in 100 water stress basins by the year 2030 and have collective positive water impact. And when we talk about the term and the concept of collective water impact, importantly, we are thinking about three dimensions of water stress: water quantity, water quality, and access to water for vulnerable communities. Those three are all very important dimensions. And so this notion of collective positive water impact will tackle one or all three of those, depending on the conditions in a basin. Why I like this framework is it's universally applicable, but tailorable to local conditions, and we know that water is hyper-local. In 2023, in the lead up to the UN Water Conference, first UN Water Conference focused on water in almost 50 years, we worked with the organizations logoed below to try to land on what are these 100 basins where we think there's the highest opportunity for businesses to work together to have this positive impact. It was a combination of looking at where is water stress already pronounced, are these economically relevant regions for companies and the global economy. We looked at climate modeling and said, what is climate change going to do to these water systems in the next 20 to 40 years? And where is there implementing partners or organizations that have capacity to make a difference on the ground? And when you put that sausage-making process together, we landed on 100 basins. Many of those are in Southeast Asia, including India. So I've talked about the net positive water impact framework. I like a lot. I've been doing water stewardship for a lot of years, and what I think is most powerful about this framework is that it's intuitive and it's very tailorable to almost any company that that has a water footprint. The first pillar of action is something that many of the companies in this room have been doing for many years. This is about reducing your operational footprint on water. This is efficiency, reuse, pollution abatement. That's table stakes for most companies, and many of the leaders on stewardship have been doing that for a long time. The second pillar is when companies finally realize that they need to understand the external context and they need to take action to try to offset the impacts associated with their water footprint. This has many names, whether it's replenish, balancing. I know that CII has a guide on water neutrality. This is very much in the spirit of what we're talking about. But again, I'm known to be pathologically candid. Replenish by itself will not build water resilient basins. It's not big enough, right? And so that's where the third pillar of action comes in, which is where like-minded companies and their counterparts in the public sector and in the independent sector start working collectively around a shared ambition to actually change conditions in a basin. So this last piece is the hardest. It takes the longest. But it's also the prize that we need to keep an eye on, because if you can't do this last piece, you will never change basin conditions. When we look at the concept of collective action, we take a very broad view at the Water Resilience Coalition. So it's this idea that stakeholders are coming together with respective expertise and skills and resources, financial or otherwise, around shared ambition, and then working toward that. The geographic scale for collective action, it varies, right? It can be at a project level, at a very, very hyper-local. It can be at a hydroshed level, basin level, national, depending on if you're trying to build relationships with national governments. Yes to all of it. And there's lots of efforts to develop a shared understanding of how this nomenclature and taxonomy works. This work was led by AWS and WWF specifically. We think this is a good working definition to move forward with. Where am I supposed to point this? Okay, so translating how this concept of collective action can work at these different levels. This is just our view of it. Everyone can think about it differently. This is how we are thinking about it. So in the green dot is around when there's projects that are that can bring stakeholders together, typically a solution or a project that lands in a location, but it can be done in a way that has a thematic alignment. So you can have a collective action around trying to improve water access and sanitation for 300 million people. That's actually one of our goals. And you can land projects in various basins along that thematic. So that would be one example of how you could think about the ways of organizing global to local. You also have the opportunity to see an existing project that is working and then bringing that bilateral partnership into a collective action by bringing more players in and then usually expanding the geographic scope of that project. That is also another way to move from a proven solution that's bilateral to something that's bigger. And the last piece is one that we've spent a lot of time giving thought about, which is this outside circle, which is how do you get a platform where you can bring stakeholders together and have a conversation around what are the priority water issues in this basin? What is our intention around how we're going to work together on a shared goal? And then how do we develop a roadmap of action and measure our progress in order to achieve that outcome? We think this is a very powerful solution. It's somewhat of a new thing in terms of who's doing it well, but there's pockets of excellence for sure. And we're going to hear about some of that. One thing that I think is important that we should always be asking ourselves when we're looking at collective action is, are our interventions adding up to be right-sized to the size of the problem, right? So the example that I like to give is you can have a lot of really good projects that are doing groundwater recharge, right? That are doing aquifer recharge. And you can measure the progress of those projects based on volumetric benefits of recharge. But if the total of those actions together are only addressing the fact that the aquifers are being depleted by this rate and your projects are only actually offsetting and you're not going to ever stabilize the aquifer, right? So you have to ultimately understand what for this region is going to be enough to actually stabilize the situation and improve water security. And that means you have to understand basin conditions where we are and what good looks like in terms of an outcome that we can work toward. We have a 8-step model. It's very tailorable to local context, but it starts with having at least a cohort of businesses and stakeholders ready to work together. There has to be an appetite. It's bringing on a project management organization that has credibility among stakeholders to have a conversation around what these key water challenges are. There's a technical assessment of what current conditions are, and then there's this joint goal setting about where you want to take things. And then most importantly, the development of all of the roadmap and interventions that can get you where it is. Most of these initiatives will only work over the long haul if they're transparent about impact and what you've accomplished. So that requires reporting and tracking so that you can see whether or not you're holding yourselves accountable to what you set out to do. This is a simple framework, super hard to do in the real world. I acknowledge that. An example of how this is working in California, and as I've said before, it works differently in different locations, that we have to accept that that's the way water lands in different parts of the world. But here's how it's worked in California, just for illustration. So the governor in California, his administration did an analysis of climate change impacts on water, and they found that by the year 2040, we're likely to have 10% less available supply. And I won't go into the science behind that. It's basically aridification and the drying of the air. So the governor had a call to action that we need to figure out how to plug this gap. And what we did under the Basin Collaborative in California is we said, okay, well, if the gap is 10% of available supply, what is the role that industry can play in contributing to narrowing this gap? And we did a bunch of calculations around industry water use, both direct operations, but also indirect water use in supply chains, mostly agriculture in the state. And we ended up coming up with a 2030 goal of 1 million acre feet, and translating that into cubic meters, it's about 1.23 cubic meters. So a volumetric goal in this case on what we're working toward to achieve the goal of the California Water Resilience Initiative. Now, the way that you get to this volumetric outcome is varied, right? There's a portfolio of interventions. You can be working on reuse strategies in industrial water use. You can work in collaboration with municipality on reuse strategies. It can be demand management in systems in the agricultural community. And it can be about investing in nature-based solutions that are both, forestry restoration that we have here or wetland restoration throughout the state. The state agencies are very interested in this initiative because now they have, the dangers of talking with your hands. The state agencies really like this because they were already going to invest in habitat protection in a number of places in the state. So the degree to which they can find a mechanism through which there can be joint action and co-investment in these strategies is welcomed. And in fact, the leadership of the CWRI was just in Sacramento doing the tour with 5 agencies that are at the state level, and they were very excited about the opportunity to jointly work and program on water in the coming years. And we'll talk about many of these types of projects today. That's very much featured in the program, but in the California context, this is an example of the range of projects that members are now contributing toward. It is a range of things from source water protection in the mountains in the Sierras, Nevada mountain range, which is the origins of a huge percentage of the state's water, as well as interventions in the agriculture in the Central Valley. I just want to call attention to the second box here, the State Water Impact, the Sustainable Water Impact Fund. This is a opportunity for companies through a private equity firm called RRG that is propped up through a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, where they are doing land acquisition and conversion and groundwater recharge. But these investments that the companies are making in this fund, which is a $1 billion fund, it's returnable capital. This is actually, it has an IRR in the high teens, and these are companies that are achieving this goal through an investment that has a return. And this is an example of how this portfolio of options for how we're going to get to our goal it ranges from philanthropy to OpEx to balance sheet investments. So that's just one example. Really looking forward to how the processes here in India will unfold and the opportunities to collaborate across organizations and businesses to move things forward at scale. So with that, I think I'm handing back.